America-China feud has begun. How the rest of the world is trapped between the hammer and the anvil. There are 193 countries in the world and only 2 of them are USA and China. It would be a safe bet to say that the remaining 191 countries are beginning to prepare actively for the roller coaster global environment that has been and will continue to be generated by the growing geopolitical contest between America and China. A few brave leaders have begun to speak openly about the dangers posed to other countries. While visiting China, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said in September 2019 that "We hope that there will be a solution in the trade dispute with the United States since it affects everybody." Similarly, speaking at the opening of the prestigious Shangri-La Dialogue on May 31, 2019, the Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Hsien Loong, bravely said that initiatives by the United States and China, like the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and Indo-Pacific cooperation, should strengthen existing cooperation arrangements centered on ASEAN, not undermine them, create rival blocs, deepen fault lines or force countries to take sides. They should help bring countries together, rather than split them apart. Chancellor Merkel and Prime Minister Lee were probably speaking for many countries when they warned that America and China were damaging the interests of other countries with their unending trade war. However, the silence of other leaders does not mean that they will sit idly by and not defend their interests. Many are working actively to defend and enhance their long-term interests. In theory, when America, under Trump, began to walk away from free trade agreements, this move could have sounded the death sentence for free trade agreements. Instead, the opposite has happened. Even though America unwisely walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, known as TPP, the other 11 members continued to implement it under a new name, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. The European Union and Mercosur also announced an in-principle agreement to proceed within free trade agreements in June 2019. Equally significantly, the African countries also proceeded with their African Continental Free Trade Agreement on May 30, 2019. Even more significantly, the largest trade agreement, in terms of population numbers involved and share of global GDP, will probably be completed in 2020. It will involve the 10 ASEAN countries and Australia, China, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. India may join later. This trade agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, will certainly lead to closer economic integration among Asian countries. It will include China. This shows the lack of wisdom of Trump's advisors who are recommending a decoupling of the American and Chinese economies. If these advisors succeed with decoupling, the result will be an America decoupled not just from China but also from the massive growth prospects of the 15 regional comprehensive economic partnership economies. In short, it would be unwise for either Beijing or Washington to assume that other countries would automatically line up to support them. Instead, each of them will carefully defend their own long-term interests. But few key players who will be directly or indirectly affected, namely Australia, the European Union, EU, Japan, India, ASEAN, and Russia. In the coming, inevitable geopolitical contest between America and China, each will be tempted to use its sturdy geopolitical muscles to cajole, bribe, pressure, and arm-twist other countries to join its side. This is normal superpower behavior. Except, the world has moved on since the Cold War. America's relative economic power and cultural influence has diminished since its heyday. China's relative economic power is far greater than that of the former Soviet Union. The most important ratio is that between the relative combined weight of America and China and that of the rest of the world. Many countries and regions have become big enough to walk away from both America and China. Most countries have also become shrewder at weighing and acting on their own geopolitical interests, and many Asian countries are carefully defining their own positions, pushing back against pressure to choose sides between the US and China. Hence, both America and China will have to get used to dealing with other countries that have become more confident and less compliant over time. The country that will have to make the most difficult geopolitical choice will be Australia. In terms of defense and culture, it is tied almost completely to America. During the Cold War, even though Australia was far away from the Soviet Union and had no reason to confront it, the country enthusiastically supported the global U.S. containment policy and never hesitated to send troops to fight in America-led causes, including the Vietnam War. As a result, Australia gained a lot by being America's most loyal ally during the Cold War. However, today, Australia would probably lose a lot and gain little by joining America's side against China. Its economy is far more tied to China than to America. In 2018, its total trade with China was 174 billion Australian dollar, while its trade with America was only 44 billion Australian dollar. If Australia were to follow the extreme American voices calling for US allies to decouple themselves from the Chinese economy, it would virtually commit national economic suicide. A former Australian ambassador to China, Jeff Raby, said, "Our interests are not identical to the US. That doesn't mean we can't have a close, warm relationship with the United States. But we cannot join the US in a policy premised on China being a strategic competitor." However, for Australia, it will not just be a matter of economics. There is an essential identity question that Australia will have to grapple with in the 21st century and beyond. As Western power slowly but steadily recedes from Asia, Australia could be left stranded, together with New Zealand, as the sole Western entities in Asia. As Western power recedes globally, Australia's predominantly Western population could feel very isolated and lonely in Asia. In the 21st century, Australia can only have a secure and confident long-term future if it integrates itself, politically and culturally, with its immediate neighbourhood, and its key neighbour is ASEAN Community, which is the second most successful regional organisation in the world after the European Union. With Australia dealing with the extremely difficult, almost existential, challenges of adapting to an Asian century, an American call to Australia to once again become a loyal deputy sheriff would be disastrous. This is why many leading Australian voices have warned their fellow Australians against blindly following American interests and policies. Similarly, it would be equally fatal for China to try to force Australia to take its side, as Australian culture is far too deeply pro-Western for Australia to be comfortable joining the Chinese camp. It helped a lot that America, Australia, and Europe traced their roots to a common Judeo-Christian heritage and Greco-Roman cultural underpinnings. Cultural affinity matters. The wisest approach for both Beijing and Washington, D.C. to take is to allow Australia to play the role of a neutral and helpful intermediary between them. It should stop being passive in its foreign policy and take a proactive approach of persuading both Beijing and Washington, D.C., why they should give Australia more space as an independent and neutral actor in the forthcoming geopolitical contest. Given Europe's geographic distance from China, America's policymakers would be outraged if the core members of the European Union didn't follow America's bidding in the geopolitical contest against China. We now need to encourage China to become a responsible stakeholder in the international system. As a responsible stakeholder, China would be more than just a member. It would work with us to sustain the international system that has enabled its success. Cooperation as stakeholders will not mean the absence of differences. There will be disputes that needs to be managed. But that management can take place within a larger framework where the parties recognize a shared interest in sustaining political, economic, and security systems that provide common benefits. Given the challenges this presents, if the Europeans, like the Australians, want to give priority to their own existential challenges, which result from their geography, they should focus on the economic and social development of Africa. The best partner to work with to develop Africa is China. Indeed, China has already emerged as the largest new economic partner of Africa. If Europe wants to preserve its own long-term interests, it should make the development of Africa, in partnership with China, an immediate priority. The country that attracts the largest number of African leaders to summit meetings is China. The most sensible thing for European leaders to do is to join, en masse, the next high-level meeting of Chinese and African leaders in Beijing. A massive turnout of European leaders at such a summit would send a powerful market signal. It could catalyze a powerful wave of new investment in Africa. Over time, with a strong African economy, there will be less incentive for widespread African migration to Europe. American pressure on its European allies will certainly increase if the European nations decide to work together with China on investing in Africa's future. The emergence of China does not pose a threat to Europe. Indeed, it could help to enhance Europe's long-term security if China promotes Africa's development. America could, of course, try to match China in developing Africa. However, the amount of funds America has offered to deploy is amazingly small. China has offered to spend over $1 trillion to promote infrastructure investments under its BRI. America cannot match such a sum. A lot of Chinese nationalist anger toward Japan, which emerges from time to time, is therefore real. Yet there is no doubt that some of it is also manufactured. This is demonstrated by the fact that China has shown a capacity to ignore this painful chapter in Sino-Japanese relations when it suited Chinese interests to do so. This is how Singapore Ambassador, Bilahari Kausikan describes the situation: as you have formally apologized for the debts you incurred in the past, it is not reasonable to ask you for payments of those debts. You cannot be asked to apologize every day, can you? It is not good for a nation to feel constantly guilty. So, when Mao Zedong met former Japanese Prime Minister Kakuei Tanaka in 1972, he brushed aside Tanaka's attempts to apologize, saying that he was grateful to Japan because without the war the Chinese Communist Party would not have been able to seize power. Even while the alliance with USA are strong, it would be unwise for the Japanese not to develop an independent, reasonably friendly relationship with China. There is one overriding reason to do so. In the next 2 or 3 decades, it is highly likely that America will retain a strong military, economic, and political presence in East Asia. It has the capability and, as of now, the desire to remain in East Asia. Yet, by 2050, when the Chinese economy could effectively be twice as large as the American economy, it is conceivable that America could give up its forward deployment in East Asia. America could withdraw from the western Pacific Ocean and retreat back into its hemisphere and live 7,000 miles away from China. Indeed, Japan cannot retreat. It will always have to live a few hundred miles away from China. The first recognition of Japan in Chinese dynastic histories can be traced to the 1st century BCE. For most of the next 2,000 years, with the exception of a few brief wars, China and Japan have lived at peace with each other. It is perfectly conceivable for China and Japan to live in peace for the next 2,000 years. China and Japan have had some 2,000 years of relations, and the really troubled relations involved only half a century, from 1894 to 1945. Well over a millennium ago, during China's Sui and Tang dynasties, contemporary with the Nara and Heian periods in Japan, the Japanese acquired their basic culture including written language, Buddhism, Confucianism, architecture, governmental organization, city planning, and art from China. This explains the extraordinary number of Chinese who choose to travel to Japan nowadays. Millions of Chinese who choose to visit Japan and enjoy the beauty of many Japanese cultural products. Indeed, it is conceivable that the Chinese may actually see in Japanese culture the future potential of Chinese culture to further excel in many areas. This culturally symbiotic relationship between China and Japan provides hope that they can overcome the painful chapter of the first half of the 20th century and return to the more traditional millennial relationship of calm and harmony. In geopolitical terms, if this were surely to happen over time, it is almost certain, even as China opens up and integrates itself with the rest of the world, that it will not become a political or social replica of a Western liberal democratic society. The cultural gap between China and the West is too great for the Chinese to feel comfortable in replicating Western social and political forms. However, the cultural gap between China and Japan is not as wide. The soul of Japan has not been westernized. As a result, there has often been a cultural discomfort between America and Japan. A closer symbolic relationship between China and Japan could over time influence the social and political evolution of China. Japan has remained politically stable, socially conservative, and culturally authentic, while adopting the trappings of Western electoral methods. It is conceivable that over time the Chinese could be influenced to importing various aspects of the Japanese model. However, it has to happen through a symbiotic process, not as a result of external pressures. Despite the significant dissimilarities between Indian and Chinese cultures, they remain fellow Asian cultures. Some of their roots are the same. For example, the religion of Buddhism, which originated in India, has had a major impact on Chinese culture and the Chinese soul. The coming of Buddhism to China was an event with far-reaching results in the development of Chinese thought and culture and of Buddhism itself, contributing greatly to the enrichment of Chinese philosophy, and also as a major system of religious practice which had an enduring influence on Chinese popular religion, along with the native traditions, Confucianism and Taoism. As Buddhism originated in India, my Hindu mother used to take me as a child to both Hindu and Buddhist temples as she felt culturally comfortable in both, even though in Singapore most of the Buddhist monks were Chinese rather than Indian. These common cultural roots between China and India will certainly play a role in their future relationship. As the power of a rising China today radiates across the subcontinent, the Indian Ocean, and the Western Pacific, balancing Beijing has become an urgent matter, especially given the relative decline of the United States. In the past, India balanced Beijing through a de facto alliance with the Soviet Union. Today, it needs a strategic partnership with the United States to ensure that China's rise will continue to be peaceful. The time has come for India to do a major reboot of its global strategic policies. It can no longer proceed on autopilot and assume that the policies of the past can guide India in this new era. India, under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has already begun doing this. Clearly, he is aware that in this new geopolitical environment he can maximize India's geopolitical advantages by maintaining good relations with both USA and China. On the matter of principle, India is absolutely right. However, wiser geostrategic thinkers have always balanced principles with pragmatism in making long-term strategic decisions. During the 70s, China did some careful long-term pragmatic calculations. Having come to realize how backward the Chinese economy had become, the Chinese leaders led by Deng Xiaoping decided to swallow the bitter pill of humiliation, a well-known Chinese phrase, and use the massive American economy to boost its own economic growth. 40 years later, we know how wise and shrewd this pragmatic Chinese decision was. The Taiwan Relations Act was passed in 1979. In that year, the Chinese economy was only about 10% that of America's. By 2014, China's economy had become larger. This shows the value of being pragmatic over being principled in international relations. Today, India's economy is about 40% that of China's. By spurning participation in the BRI, India is sacrificing a valuable opportunity to grow its economy rapidly. However, its refusal to participate in the BRI is a strategic disadvantage India has imposed on itself. However, if it wants to fast-track its emergence as a great power, it has to do what China did with its economy, apply externally induced shock therapy to shake out the uncompetitive elements of the Chinese economy and develop new competitive dimensions. This was the goal of Zhu Rongji when he negotiated China's entry into the WTO in 2001. This shock therapy worked. In 2000, China's economy was 8 times smaller than America's economy in nominal market terms. In 2016, it was only 1.5 times smaller. Applying external shock therapies does make economies grow faster. Since China is emerging as the number one geopolitical competitor of America and India is emerging potentially as the number one geopolitical ally of America, these attitudes make no geopolitical sense, except that they inadvertently imply the reality that Americans have more respect for China than for India. Eventually, after 2021, USA will move into a post-Trump world. America can then begin to try to work out a consistent long-term policy of deep engagement with India. A deep and bold partnership between America and India would enable India to play a significant role in acting as a bridge between America and the Asian century. The ASEAN, or Association of Southeast Asian Nations, could also play a significant bridging role. Today, ASEAN represents one of the most promising economic regions in the world. ASEAN countries have gone from having economies that were among the poorest in the world to developing the fourth largest economy in the world by 2030. The 650 million people in Southeast Asia represent a major strategic opportunity for America. The sensible thing for American policymakers would be to pay attention to this strategic opportunity. Over time, Russia will emerge as a key ally of America when the level of geopolitical competition between America and China intensifies. The country that has the longest border with China is Russia. The relative economic and political weights of Russia and China have shifted dramatically. In 1979, after Mao's policies in the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution had seriously weakened China, the economy of the then Soviet Union, led by Russia, was several times larger than that of China. In 2019, China's economy, $12.2 trillion, is 7.75 times larger than that of Russia's, $1.6 trillion. By 2050, China's economy will become even larger. Even though Russia has a nuclear arsenal that dwarfs that of China, and Russia need never fear an outright military invasion from China, as it will never happen, it would still be prudent for Russia to find an ally to balance a neighbor that much larger in size and influence. The most natural ally is America. It makes sense then if, sometime in the next few decades, an alliance develops between America and Russia. Americans have a more substantial truth to confront if they wish to reset their relations with Russia. After the end of the Cold War, American leaders betrayed the explicit and implicit promises that they made to the Russian leaders. America had promised Russia that, after the dismantling of the Warsaw Pact, America would not expand NATO eastward to threaten Russia. What geopolitical calculations played out in American minds as they made this fatal decision to expand NATO? Did they believe that since Russia was weak and struggling in the 1990s, with an imploding economy and a financial crisis that brought great suffering to the Russian people, America could once and for all time eliminate Russia as a potential competitor? It seems hard to believe that America had a sinister plot to permanently eliminate Russia as a geopolitical competitor. Nonetheless, America's disregard for Russia's interests in the 1990s and 2000s looks to have been the result of a concerted plan. Regardless of whether there was a conscious American plan to weaken Russia after the end of the Cold War, it would be useful for Americans and Russians to have a frank discussion face-to-face of their respective perceptions of what happened. A frank reassessment by Americans of their policies toward Russia could result in several dividends for U.S. long-term geopolitical thinking. The past cannot be changed, however, if Americans become more aware of the humiliation that U.S. policies inflicted upon the Russians, they can begin to remove some of the key psychological obstacles preventing the early emergence of an effective Russo-American alliance. America is less likely to make serious mistakes in its future geopolitical policies toward China if it develops a good understanding of the positive moves and the mistakes it has made in its relations with other countries. America has done more right than it has done wrong. This explains the relatively good relations America has had with most countries in the world. Yet, it is also true that America has made several unnecessary and painful mistakes, especially with the Islamic world and with Russia. In short, unlike the Cold War, where a clear majority of countries showed greater sympathy for the successful America over the failing Soviet Union, it is far from clear that a similar outcome will emerge in the new Sino-American contest. Most countries will, in one way or another, hedge their bets. Both America and China will have to learn to play a more sophisticated game if they want to win countries over to their side. For more, see the book Has China Won? By Kishore Mahbubani.